Okay, so welcome. I feel like I am in Freud's salon, okay, in the late 1800s or early 1900s. And everybody in this room is very interested in social and emotional learning. And Dr. Lee and I were having a conversation about how our adolescence was horrific for different reasons. And we wanted to, I was talking about how Patricia had invited me on the board of PS I Love You, and I was helping her with the curriculum for the 7th and 8th grade. And Dr. Lee had told me how he was giving many talks about adolescence. And so I thought, what a great marriage for all of us to share and listen to and learn a new paradigm for adolescence, because we clearly need one. Clearly need one. So here we are. Listen to the expert. No pressure though.
All right. Thank you everyone for coming. I'm Dr. Joseph Lee. I'm also a dad. My background is that I've been a psychiatrist and a therapist out here in the community for about 12 years. So about 9 years ago, because my son's 9, became a parent. And so becoming a parent actually sort of reoriented me to a lot of different things. So one of the things that happens when you go to medical school is that you find out that medicine is not really about helping people to become healthy. It's everything that you learn is really how to help people who are sick become no longer sick. And which is very useful and it's very good. But there was no part of that sort of medical school or residency training that really talked about health and well-being. And when you become a parent, you become very sort of aware of the not so subtle difference between somebody who is not sick versus somebody who is actually thriving and healthy, because as parents, that's what we want for our kids. So I kind of went back to a different kind of self-learning process that was in many ways built upon the stuff that I learned as a psychiatrist, but it was a lot more self-directed in my learning. And I think in the past 9 years, I've really sort of been learning more about how the way that we manage our emotions, the quality of our relationships throughout our whole lifespan, that those types of things really have a much, much greater impact upon our whole life's well-being than things that we normally consider regarding physical health. So a lot of that has guided my personal philosophy back into my practice, definitely in my parenting. And in the last couple of years, I've had the fortune of sort of being able to do a couple of things in education as well, in terms of working with some of my friends and colleagues who are in this space. So this particular talk, which is maybe not surprisingly very popular, I've given it a few times here in the South Bay, because this idea of puberty and adolescence is kind of this period of time when the emotions and the social goals fundamentally change. And as Nadine mentioned, I imagine that for most of us in this room, when that shift happened for us personally, it wasn't exactly a smooth transition. I don't know about you guys, but thinking back to my 7th and 8th grade years was not exactly like the most wonderful, meaningful, amazing time of my life. It was probably the most confusing aspect of my life. And I think that kind of still continues to trickle down in terms of how we think about our own adolescence. We think about it as a time to get through a difficult time. And I think most of us don't have a great understanding as to why did we all have to go through that. So the goal here today is we're going to talk a little bit about puberty, but for the most part, we're going to talk about adolescence. And adolescence is this very important and actually purposeful time in our lives. And we're going to hopefully shift a big sort of paradigm as to how we think about this era of life, okay? All right, so most of the time when I do this talk, we're usually thinking about not necessarily adolescence. Actually, I think the reason why this particular talk has been popular is specifically most parents are actually thinking about puberty. This is the thing that freaks them out. This is the thing that they're worried about. So we will start there. So puberty is the beginning of adolescence, so it is a relevant time. The relevant time is, it marks the biological beginning of adolescence, right? And then it goes And it kind of ends actually somewhere in the middle of adolescence. Adolescence continues. So one way to think about adolescence and how this all fits is, okay, so you got this caterpillar here, and this is an immature sort of stage. And after adolescence, somewhere in there, we all arrive here in our adulthood, right? So this is a mature butterfly. And so when we think about adolescence, it's this idea as to what exactly is happening in this in-between space. How does a human being who is young and immature eventually become an adult? And that's how we should really frame and understand adolescence. All right, so to make this a little bit more personal, I want all of us to kind of think about our own childhood. Think about a time in your life when you remember that you were definitely a kid. All right, this is prior to adolescence. All right, so for a visual, if you can't think of your own childhood, this is mine. All right, so this is me. I'm roughly about 4 years old. I am clearly in my childhood stage at this time. All right, so when we think about childhood, what was it like to be a kid? What's it like to be a kid in an ideal sense? When you're a kid, other people are responsible for taking care of you. That your needs are met by others, and that's normal. And so if you've had a very positive and warm childhood, a lot of it has to do with that. A lot of it has to do with the feeling that your childhood was warm, that your needs were met, and life was good if that was the case, right? So sometime after this picture, I personally hit puberty. And so this is me in the middle here. So the funny thing about this picture is, okay, so this is obviously after my growth spurt. And the funny thing about this picture is these three cousins of mine, this guy, I'm about 6 feet tall, right? So these little short munchkins here. This guy's 6'3" now. This guy is the short one at 5'11", and this guy's 6'2". So it just kind of contrasts. Okay, so something happens. Okay, so here's the biological part, right? Growth, changes in our bodies. But after puberty, adolescence continues, all right? So this is a picture of me later on in my adolescence. Actually, this is a picture specifically of my 21st birthday. My sister is 6 years older. I had some secret plan with my parents to decide that the best thing for me to do to celebrate my 21st birthday was to be at home. So my sister said, don't worry, I'll keep it safe. We'll be at home. I'll buy a little alcohol. And so my sister did that. It was fun. And this is roughly me at the end of my adolescence. This is my medical school graduation. I was about 24, 25 years old. And that's roughly about when adolescence ends, right? So there's puberty and there's adolescence, which is much longer. And interestingly, I think for me, this was a unique time in my life. At my graduation, I had just come back from my honeymoon, so I had just gotten married. I had finished my sort of formal education in medical school. I was about to start my residency, and I had already at that point obviously picked psychiatry, so I was about to begin my career. And so it really was a transitional moment where I was really about to step into my own adulthood. All right, so that's kind of the setup. So we're going to talk about adolescence, but in order to understand that better, we should start here. So adolescence is that transitional period out of childhood, right? So roughly it's the birth to the onset of adolescence. And what's this stage in life like? There's a lot of rapid growth, and there's milestones. And what that means is that typically from kid to kid, we have this normal expectation of what it's like and what we expect in terms of this growth process. If you think about the first birthday, most people kind of know that typically for most kids are about to take their first steps, maybe around age 2. Most kids can say a couple of words. By age 3, most kids are able to, go to the bathroom by themselves and maybe feed themselves. And this is relatively consistent. So that kind of says something about development at this stage, which is that there's a very predictable pattern of growth in our childhood that's very much sort of determined by a very common pathway as human beings. This process can't be accelerated, meaning even if you want your kids at age 1 to be able to talk, there's something developmentally that they just aren't yet ready to do that. So we can't accelerate that process, but it can be slowed down. And usually the process of development can be slowed down, usually if primary needs aren't met. And of course, there's things that we can think about if a kid sort of grew up malnourished or didn't have enough sort of basic needs, and of course their growth might be stunted. But we also kind of know that this is also true about kids' needs when it comes to relationships as well. That's actually one of the primary needs that really predicts whether or not a kid really thrives, has to do with whether or not their sort of relationship needs are met. So at this stage, almost everything is sort of predetermined by biological factors, which means that something is pre-programmed into the DNA from the moment of conception through all of our childhood. That predictable pathway as to how that development happens by the first birthday, the second birthday, the third birthday is determined by biological factors. And this was my last point, which is that secure attachment in childhood, if those primary needs of relationship, of being cared for, and in terms of attachment, we're really talking about feeling safe, secure, seen, and soothed. If those needs are met, then what we know is that kid's, the rest of their brain development is positively facilitated. So everything else about their mental maturity goes a lot better if their primary relationship needs are met early in life. So what does that mean? A typical childhood looks something like this. It absolutely requires others to help meet primary needs. So your success, your fulfillment, your health in your childhood is very much dependent upon how your caregivers and your support system meet your needs. And that's part of a normal childhood. Learning is done at this stage in life through absorption, meaning kids kind of just like take in the world. They just absorb their experiences, they absorb their learning. At this stage in life, emotions are actually very much a part of their communication, right? So even before kids can express things in words, or even if you've taught your kids sign language at a very young age, they're already communicating to you very much, when they're infants and little babies, basically through their emotions. You can tell when they're happy, which means that their needs are being met, or if they're distressed, they're crying, they're letting you know that something's wrong, right? So emotions, when you're a kid, when you're a child, is part of our nonverbal communication, and that's really one of the primary purposes. At this stage in life, beliefs are flexible. What does that mean? It means that most kids can believe something for a while, and they can feel like that it's totally true, and then some extra piece of information comes along, and they're like, really? Huh. And they revise it, right? Okay, so, all right, so if this ever goes to the internet, I'm gonna actually have to put this spoiler warning here because I just did this parenting conference where I used the same example I'm about to give to you guys. So, and then one of the parents wrote, would have been nice to have a warning about the very clear example you gave about Santa Claus. All right, so this is the warning. If kids are watching online, turn off. Okay, so the example of beliefs are flexible is, right? So most kids, up until a certain point in their life, probably believe that Santa Claus is real, right? Most people in this room. And then so what happens though, at some point, some older kid, some guy giving a talk online, and the kid overhears some piece of information and said, what? What do you mean Santa Claus is not real? And then it takes a little while and they process it, then all things start clicking, and they're like, yeah, now it makes sense. I never understood why of all the malls in the world, he would go to the Del Amo Mall. And it never made sense to me how he can manufacture video games at the North Pole, and things click. And then all of a sudden after a while, then kids are like, oh man, Santa Claus is not real. And it doesn't matter that they believe that for 8 or 9 years. Okay, so that's important. And this is important. Everything we're talking about here is important because we're going to start to talk about how these fundamentals of a normal childhood start to change and how they're different in later stages in life. And then this last part, which is, again, attachment relationships. One of the main things that is positive and healthy that you want coming out of childhood, because, again, of the first point, that a healthy and successful childhood is built around having your needs met. So it also makes sense that if your attachment relationships are successful, that you feel safe and you feel secure and you feel seen and you feel soothed by the caregivers and the adults and the people that sort of surround you in your support system in life, that highly predicts an optimal development and sets you up for a positive future. Okay, so this is a normal childhood. Okay, so now we're going to transition. All right, so now we're going to go on to adolescence. So, when does adolescence start? It starts at the onset of puberty, which is around age 10 in girls, about 12 in boys, and it continues to about age 24, 25. I think we're talking about we'll get to it. We'll talk about how this stage is probably much longer than we normally think of in terms of the differences between puberty and adolescence. So the physical and sexual maturity are probably reached maybe around 16 or 17, something that's worth considering, and we'll get to this later. We'll come back to this as to why this is relevant. The onset of first period these days is about 12 and a half for girls. About 100 years ago, that was about age 16. So for reasons that we don't quite understand, the age in which puberty and therefore adolescence starts is actually getting younger and younger. So one way to kind of really remember why this is relevant, it does kind of mean that adolescence is longer than it's historically been. When we talk about some of these changes that we are kind of familiar with, I think the common narrative is that we think it's raging hormones, because we're obviously aware that there's big hormone changes, and we think that that's why all these things that we are familiar with when we think about our own early teen years, or if you're parents of teenagers and you've gone through this, the common narrative is that it's all due to hormones. In reality, it's not. Most of the changes that we're familiar with, and we're going to go through this in great detail, are very deliberate and important changes that are happening because of brain changes and brain remodeling. The reason why we go through all these changes is that all this, and this is really going to be the primary point, that the main changes that start to happen in adolescence are actually crucial and important foundational changes to set us up for adulthood. And they're not a stage just to kind of like get through, but getting through them well is actually very important to kind of, again, have healthy adulthoods. And the reason why these changes are important is because as a kid, we mentioned that you're basically in this stage where it's normal and it's healthy for you to be taking care of others. Then we have this middle period leading us to adulthood, where in adulthood, you're supposed to be equipped to take care of yourself. And you are also the one now that's supposed to be taking care of other people. So how do you go from this state of mind where it's normal and good for you to be taken care of by others to get to the place where you yourself become the caregiver? And so this is the important and necessary reason why we have to go through this stage of adolescence. All right, so one of the things that we definitely know is at some point early on, kids start becoming very focused on their peer relationships, and this is one of the main shifts. Instead of being all about mommy and daddy, it's about their friends, and it's important to them. And sometimes, especially in early adolescence, it almost feels like it's life and death. It's so important to them to have the right friends, to belong to the right group, to be seen in the right way, to be wearing the right clothes. And there's an anxiety that you start to see very early on when this change starts to happen, that the level of importance that their mind is telling them about needing to belong, no longer to their family, but belonging with their friends or their peer group. Right? This is one of the early shifts that you start to see. One of the biological changes that I like to talk about, because I think a lot of parents sort of struggle with this, and the world in which we live doesn't really accommodate this too much, is that there's very real sleep changes that we can observe at this stage. So, I don't know, my son's about 9, and he still does about 9 hours of sleep. I imagine there's very few teenagers that are really getting about 9.5 hours of sleep these days, but that's actually optimal. And you're not imagining things, and neither are they. Their normal sleep cycle, for whatever reason, shifts forward. So the amount of time in which they feel awake during the evening and night stays longer than the rest of us. And so they kind of do want to sleep later. And in fact, there's actually a sort of hyper-wakeful time between 9 and 10. And they definitely have a sleep trough in the mid-afternoon, sort of a long, deep nap that they like to take in the afternoon. Learning is actually improved when you get a good sleep the night after, not necessarily like getting a good night's sleep before a test. So for example, for all of us in this room, if you want to internalize everything you learned today. It's more important that you sleep well tonight. So that'll change your plans after the evening's over. All right. So dietary needs correlate with rapid growth. What does that mean? It just means that they eat a lot more, and boys more than girls. So the second big change besides those physical changes, so the first one is peer-oriented relationships. Remember we talked about with kids, emotions is for communication. It's to express their needs to others. That still continues, where emotions are part of our nonverbal communication, but there's a new thing that happens. The new thing that happens is that emotions start going from how they experience the world to also start to serve a purpose in motivation. Right? So again, this is one of the primary shifts, right? Because instead of having other people take care of you, you start to develop your inside tools. And one of the inside tools is your internal motivation, which comes from emotions. There's more risk-taking, and there's definitely a lower level of fear-based responses. This is a wonderful study that I like to talk about to illustrate this. So they got a group of kids, and they got a group of adolescent teenagers, and they got a group of adults, and they were able to kind of, during this study, scan their brains to kind of see, depending on what you asked them or what you asked them to imagine, what parts of the brain would light up, and it kind of gave you a sense as to how different age groups would process things. So they asked this one question to all three groups, okay? And so, I'm going to ask you guys the same question in this room, okay? So I want you to kind of really focus and really think about this one, right? What would it be like to chew a light bulb? Okay, so I saw most of you respond with this sort of like grimace, right? And so when you ask that question and you're scanning the brains of young kids correctly to them, because that's a dangerous thing to do, the fear part of their brain, right, that would light up and say, that's dangerous. You shouldn't chew a light bulb. That would be bad. When you scan the brains of the adults, like the adults in this room, we had a very, very similar response. That amygdala, that part of the brain that says dangerous, do not chew light bulbs, it lit up. And when you scan the brains of the teenagers, that part of the brain did not light up. The imagination, the evaluation part of the brain says, well, since I've never chewed a light bulb, I can't really answer that question for you. Let me think about what, so that's remarkable, isn't it? Okay, so teenagers, they actually do have a lower sense of what's dangerous and what's harmful. Now, based on that same study, I see a lot of fear-based responses in this room right now, probably of parents with teenagers. Okay, so why? And the other thing about that same study says, though, that part does come back online, though, you see. It's a temporary thing, right? Because the adults, just like in this room, somewhere it comes back online where it's like, you know what, it is a bad idea to chew a light bulb at some point. So there's this temporary state in adolescence, it's very deliberate, it's very consistent, that for some reason, that part of their brain shuts down. This is coupled with another observation, which is the same observation that probably if you spend a lot of time with teenagers, you are totally aware of. They are actually genuinely way more bored at baseline than the rest of us. They are bored out of their minds. They really, really have a very low level of stimulation when they're not doing anything. All right, so the thought as to why this is, coupled with emotion and motivation, has to do with this idea. If you're a kid, again, and you absorb things into the world, and that's how you learn, but your brain is telling you one day you're going to have to take care of yourself and you're going to have to take care of other people, one of the things that would be useful is for you to verify whether or not everything you learned as a kid is in fact reliable and true. And here's the problem. Your parents lied to you about Santa Claus, and so there are things that you kind of know that not necessarily everything that I did learn and I did experience in my childhood is true. So what do? You become a scientist. You start experimenting and you start saying things like, well, the only way for me to really know if that's true is I kind of have to try it by myself, right? And if you kind of have in the back of your mind things that you learned from your childhood that made you scared, like chewing light bulbs, you would never try that. So what happens is your brain kind of temporarily gives you a pass and says, you know what? Let's just say everything you learned is false, and there's only one way to verify. And so in order for you to become a brave scientist in the world, you have to be able to overcome your fear And so there's this nice little gimmick where you stop fearing so that you can do this. Couple that with boredom, which even in our adulthood is the normal uncomfortable feeling that we have inside us that just makes us want to do something, right? And so hopefully this picture starts to make sense as to why these intentional and deliberate and useful in the right context changes happen in adolescence, because it's one of the ways in which we start becoming internally motivated to learn on our own. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Too much.
And so it comes to this. So it's testing beliefs through experience. It's a reappraisal. It's like, that might be true. Let me go verify. It's basically sort of how a teenager starts to go through life. Coupled with this is another change, which is a creative exploration. There is a drive to want to do things differently. So in this process of learning and finding out what's true and what's not true and becoming scientists and experimenters in the world, what they also come to learn is that some of the things that I was taught, okay, maybe are true, but some of the things that they also learn is, yeah, I kind of get that's why people told me to do it that way, but you know what? I think I could do it better. And I think that this is useful potentially, because it does mean that this sort of like drive to do it differently and a willingness to be creative does actually potentially improve a lot of problems in the world. Maybe it's not a coincidence that things like Facebook and Apple Computer were started in a garage by people that are roughly 19 or 20 years old. Because there's a certain thinking outside the box, there's a certain drive to do it differently that might have sort of turned into something like that. And so this is a normal part, right? If you've dealt with or interacting with a lot of teenagers, sometimes, unfortunately, this also seems like, coupled with the last one, that it seems like they think that you're idiots. They think that you don't know what you're doing. They think that the way that you do it is stupid. And sometimes they say it in such crude language as well. However, it comes from this place where there is a conviction inside of them that really believes, like, because I can do it better, right? And so if we can reinterpret that a little bit and kind of understand where that comes from.
And probably you already lied to me about Santa Claus.
Exactly, and you are not the most reliable source of information anyways, right? So here's another fascinating thing. We actually lose about 50% of the neurons that we have throughout this stage in our life. We lose half of our neurons during adolescence. There is a very deliberate editing process where, again, half. So why is that? Okay, so if you think about how a kid learns, again, they sponge up the world, just take everything in. This is an important process of editing, right? So we're all into technology these days, and I don't know how many of you have ever gotten to that point where basically your iPhone or your computer, your hard drive has gotten full, or it's close to full, right? And so what do you do when you do that? You basically look through your pictures and you start deciding, well, I really don't need 14 pictures of this one scene, or 22 pictures of my cat. I can delete a lot of this because it's not useful anymore to me, right? So basically that's sort of the idea, that your brain has some sort of software in the background that decides neurons that you haven't used in a long time, that you actually don't find useful, because if you did, you would have been using them. Those are the ones that go. Those are the ones that are pruned out. So there is a bit of this sort of like use it or lose it sort of mentality that's kind of important in this stage in life, which is that if you do really want your kids to continue to, like my kids, learn Chinese, that they're going to need to still be doing that in their teenage years. Otherwise, it doesn't matter how many summers I send them, between now and age 9, if they stop using it through their teenage years, it's going to be something that probably kind of gets edited out, okay? So even though this happens, it's for good reason. Now, the other thing that happens in the brain is that the neurons that remain, though, the ones that are still there, the ones that you use, there's a process where they get myelinated, which means that they kind of get insulated, which really means that they get to go a lot faster. So your brain does become more efficient in the sense that the ones that you hold on to, the ones that you use, they speed up. So your rate of thinking, your ability to think on your feet speeds up. The other thing that happens as well is that instead of just volume, which is again how kids learn, they just take in everything, our brain starts to make connections here. So different parts of our brain start to connect. When we're younger, a lot of those sort of old ideas about left brain tasks and right brain tasks, right? If you guys are familiar with this idea, people think of the left brain as sort of being logical and your language, things that make you grounded in the world, and maybe your right brain is your creative thinking, maybe your emotions come from that. So starting in adolescence, different parts of the brain start to connect. And so as an example, if you really think about this as we mature, people that are the most competent, people that are the best at what they do, it's actually specifically because they start to integrate sort of these diverse functions, right? Somebody who is, like the difference between somebody who is very technically good at, let's say somebody who's, and we'll start to talk about this in the context of social emotional learning, like what really is the difference between somebody who knows how to draft versus somebody who's a very talented architect, right? The difference is that you have this technical skill that might be sort of a left brain type of task, but what you're adding on top of that is you start to add these elements of creativity, problem solving, and design, which we normally think of as sort of like a left brain task, right? Somebody can be a very, very good artist, but in order to be like, let's say, a great filmmaker, right? One of the best filmmakers of our time, it's because in some level they've been able to combine their creativity with their high-level technical skill making, right? So they make very highly complex films and movies, and they can manage people and storylines, and they can think critically with maybe their baseline earlier life talent of being a creative person, right? So this also starts to happen in adolescence, that some of our abilities enhance, not because they grow, but because they integrate. Does that make sense? All right, so to kind of summarize, the goals of adolescence are a couple of things. One of them, right, to separate, so if you think about it, when you come into the world, you're born into a family, your relationships are sort of already well established. And then adolescence starts some of these changes. So the first goal of adolescence is that you start to want to be your own person, to forge your own identity. So this is one of the goals that you use, that we all have coming through our adolescence. The second one is connectedness, that we actually do want to start making our own relationships, and we want to be known by other people. And then the last one is actually an important one, is that actually there is an internal drive for a life of significance. They want their lives to actually matter, all right? And so these are kind of the three goals. For the more experiential left brain people in the room, I don't know if anyone's seen this movie. It's actually, so it's a very unique film. The three principal actors were filmed for 15 years, I believe, 1 week at a time with the same filmmaker. Starts off when this boy was a kid, and with his two parents, and basically the movie is this edited film where they follow this family over the span of 15 years. It's a remarkable film. What's really cool about the experience too is it doesn't kind of have little cards that pop up and say 1 year later or anything like that. This is a very organic story told about basically growing up and transitioning from boyhood. So it starts off when he's about 7 or 8 years old, and it ends in his first year in college. And it also kind of talks about not just the kids' experience, but the sort of the changes that the parents also experience as they experience the changing dynamics of their roles as parents as well. All right, so so a lot of what I'm talking about here comes from a book by Daniel Siegel. He's also a child and adolescent psychiatrist, and he summarizes a lot of these changes in adolescence by going through a couple of these items here. So the first one he talks about is the emotional spark, which we kind of talked about, where emotions shift from just communicating, where they also become part of our motivation. The social engagement is the second part, where the connections become a priority, right? The shift to peer-oriented relationships, where they want to seek meaningful and mutually rewarding relationships. One, again, these changes is, again, the relationships you have as a kid are the ones that are already there, the family you're born into. And then again, at this stage in life, you choose the relationships. You start to form your own. There's this novelty seeking where you kind of want to do things differently. You're seeking new experiences. You want to try it for yourself. And then the last part is sort of this creative exploration where you test your beliefs through experience. And so one way to kind of really remember what is sort of adolescence is to kind of think in this term, right? So the reason I bring up Dan Siegel is because, you know, amongst the many things that he's very good at in terms of making very complex brain science things easy to understand, he's also very good at these mnemonics, right? So adolescence, right? If you can kind of sort of break it down, the emotional spark, the social engagement, the novelty, and the creative exploration. All right, so that's part of the take-home message that I kind of want everyone to kind of remember, which is that these are the 4 core changes that happen in adolescence. The second point, which we're going to talk about a little bit here, is that these 4 core aspects here are actually also the foundation of healthy adulthood, you see. So it's not just that these are 4 changes that happen in adolescence, that basically the changes are the necessary foundational changes for us to have well-being and success in our adulthood as well. We'll go through this a little bit more detailed. Just to review how this is again different from childhood with each one of these categories, the emotions go from again just expression towards adding motivation. The social engagement expands from your childhood, where the relationships go from your family as being your primary relationships to chosen connections that you make. Novelty preference goes from feeling safe and secure and comfortable to seeking out new experiences on your own. And the creative exploration, so learning expands from just absorbing and taking things in to critical thinking, exploring, questioning, experimenting, and then if you master that, actually creating new things on your own. Which leads us to, okay, adulthood. So 25 and on, this is all of us as adults. That really is me about 15 years ago. So our physical and mental development at this point have matured. What does that mean? It means that the way that we kind of live our lives at this point, from a mental standpoint, we're mostly mentally stable. We're less flexible in our beliefs. We can be a lot more rigid. What we believe is what we believe. And it takes a lot more for us to kind of change those beliefs. From a physical standpoint, it's mostly maintenance at this point. There's no ongoing growth that basically we maintain our health and well-being. And if we do change, and this is important, we do change. So the old myth that, you know, that at 25, the brain that you got is the brain that you keep, that's not quite true. We do continue to change and grow and adapt our whole lives, but it's no longer developmental. It's no longer determined by this magical biological process that starts at conception until 25. If we change as adults, it's primarily because we're learning, and more often than not, we're learning because we're adapting. Something is happening in our lives, around us, inside of us, adapting to the environment, adapting to a new insight. But that's usually the reason why we change in adulthood. And we can, again, but it's a more deliberate process of intentional learning when we're talking about adulthood. So when we think about those 4 categories now, though, and now we're talking about how that looks like in adulthood, and this is really how we tie this to social emotional learning. So this is what we know about emotional intelligence. What we know about emotional intelligence is that people who are competent in being self-aware about their feelings, people who know what to do with their emotions in the context of understanding that it helps you sort through all sorts of information and decide intelligently what's relevant, what are the relevant insights, and can turn that into a healthy, persistent motivation. That people who know how to do that, people who have those skills, tend to do better in life. We also know that social intelligence, people who are good in relationships, actually also do better in life. In fact, when you look at well-being studies, if you look at the highest predictor as to why people have life satisfaction, people usually report that they feel like their life has meaning, which means that they have this sense where their positive features, their talents, their skills, what they have to contribute to the world, they're able to use that for the sake of something or someone outside of themselves. And on some level, that might be philanthropy. On some level, that might be charity. But on the most basic level, the most common experience as to how we take the best of us and we give it to others has to do with relationships. So people who have loving and meaningful relationships tend to be the most fulfilled and have the most life satisfaction as well. In education, there's big conversations about this idea of growth mindset, how to be a lifelong learner. And this is the beginning we talked about in adolescence of sort of this creative exploration, this desire to do things differently. The more effectively that as adults we can hold on to this sort of growth mindset where we believe that we can always be learning, that we're challenging our own beliefs. Those are the people that also tend to incrementally in life continue to make progress forward because they have the capacity and the willingness and the desire to keep growing. And the last part, which is creative exploration, kind of gave an example earlier where I said that the highest competencies in the world are people that are able to combine things that they're good at, but they can apply it in sort of creative and new ways. And so creativity is actually in some different models in terms of brain science and education. People often say that creativity on top of competency is probably the sort of the most intelligent thing that a person could possibly do. And that could be manifested in problem solving, that could be manifested in doing something that no one else has done before. So the idea is that creativity is actually sort of one of these higher order things that we can do. So this is kind of the second point, right? So one is that these four fundamental changes that happen in adolescence. And the second point is that those four fundamental changes that happen in adolescence very much lay the foundation for success, fulfillment, and well-being in our adulthood. So not only is it important that we kind of have a shift in our paradigm and understanding what adolescence is for, we actually want to foster and develop that in our adolescents and our teens, because that really also sets them up for ongoing adult success. And this is from Dan Siegel's book, where he basically summarizes that this is the essence of living well during adolescence and during the adult years. More often than not, I'm giving this talk to parents. I know there's some parents in the room. So one of the ways that I want to talk about is, and this can apply to educators as well, because you guys are all in the same position. So I want to talk about a little bit quickly how this is different when you have this role as a kid versus how you have a role towards children versus this role towards an adolescent. All right, so this is it's a 100-year model of developmental psychology by the psychologist. His name is Lev Vygotsky. So the funny thing, or the interesting thing, is 100 years later now, brain science, formal psychology research turns out he's totally right. Okay, so all right, so so this circle right here is future growth. This means this is our total human potential. This is what we are eventually capable of doing. But we're born into the world very capable. We're born into the world capable of very, very little, right? Okay. So what we're capable of, we'll call it autonomy. Autonomy means the stuff that we are all able to do with no assistance, with total competency, all by ourselves. All right. So we're born into the world with very little autonomy, but as we kind of grow and develop, we gain autonomy, right? So how does that happen? It happens developmentally because there's always this bleeding edge where just outside of what we're doing well, we start to emerge in our abilities to do something else on top of that. So in this model, they call that the zone of proximal development. And what happens is if you have enough support and enough practice doing these sort of new things in the zone of proximal development, eventually that becomes your new autonomy, and you continue to have this sort of bleeding edge of development about what you're always emerging and about to do. Okay, so there's these three zones. So when we talk about future growth, and we're talking about kids first, right? Pre-adolescence, pre-puberty. This is what a kid's not able to do on their own, right? This is future growth. So you're talking about a 6-year-old, you can't ask them to drive themselves to school. Under no circumstances will they have the ability to do this, right? This is beyond their ability. So if that's the case for parents, for teachers, for mentors, for other caregivers in life, your role is very clear. You have 100% full responsibility. In this context, if you're talking about something that kids are not able to do, you are the caregiver. This is all on you. If you expect a kid to do something in this zone because they can't, they have no choice but to improvise, which means that they will make compromises, and because they can't really do it, no matter what, they're going to be frustrated. That's going to be the guaranteed outcome. And so, unnecessary neglect at this time, asking kids to do things that are beyond their capacity, will make them feel anxious. If they don't know that they're not supposed to be able to do that, it'll create self-doubt, it'll affect their self-esteem. Autonomy, this is what kids can do by themselves, right? This is a good one, right? Because for the adults in the kid's life, what is your role here? Do nothing. Enjoy it. This is because why? Because by definition, this is what they can do by themselves. However, parents don't do this now, do they? They hover, they helicopter. So if you let kids, though, do the things that they're good at, this genuinely actually reinforces their self-esteem. It's not the good job. It's not you're the best. It's the ability for kids to spend time doing things that they are good at and for them to feel good about doing the things that they're good at. Which leads to, okay, what happens if you don't let them do that? So unnecessary intervention by this time. Parents, it's confusing, right? Makes them feel like, am I not doing it right? Am I doing it wrong? Makes them question, right? And that actually affects their self-confidence as well, questions their sense of competency. There's this book, Alison Gopnik, she's a psychologist. Her background is both in parenting and education. This is the model that I like to kind of talk about. So keep this in mind, the gardener and the carpenter. Because we're going to talk about this zone of proximal development. So this is a zone where, again, the kid's ability to do this is emerging. And so, in this stage, the adult is an engaged collaborator. But we want to think of it as a gardener, right? Why? Because the parenting model in the last couple of decades has turned into basically the parent as a project manager or a carpenter who takes all these raw materials and decides what they want to build, and they build up this kid into this model of what they want, right? So how is a gardener model different? Gardener model says, well, your kid has come into the world, and once they're born, now you realize that even though you really, really, really wanted an avocado tree, your kid is a tomato plant. And as much as you would like for your kid to be an avocado tree, there's nothing you can possibly do to make a tomato plant grow avocados. And so what do you do as a good gardener, though? If you are an avocado tree farmer, but now you got a tomato plant, what you do is you learn about tomato plants. And you figure out the needs of a tomato plant that are different than an avocado tree. Maybe stuff translates, right? They kind of all need sunshine, they all need water, they all need fertilizer, but you learn that there's different needs. And also, I like the gardening model is good because it really suggests this idea of development. You're gonna do different things when it's a seed versus a little small plant versus the times in the year when there's not bearing fruit versus when it is bearing fruit and when to harvest. And so it kind of is a good mental model to kind of think about how we ought to be as parents, right? And I think that, and the easiest way for us to learn, this particular concept is that you have 2 kids. And so once you have 2 kids, what you learn is all those wonderful things that you thought were so awesome about your parenting, like my wife and I, when our first son was sleeping through the night at 3.5 months, and all of our poor friends were suffering through, we're like, what you guys really need to do is, and then you start giving all this advice about like, you got to keep them on a schedule, and blah, blah, blah. And like, you'll figure it out, right? And then what happens is you have a second kid who, despite applying the exact same strategies, won't sleep through the night until 8.5 months, no matter what you do. Okay, so one of my kids is an avocado tree, and one of my kids is a tomato plant, and that's what I found out. So, and what works for one kid doesn't work for the other, right? And what works at one stage in life for those kids doesn't work for another. So, be gardeners. Appropriate support and scaffolding helps optimize the growth towards competency and their autonomy for young kids when you're a good gardener. Unnecessary intervention by adults is confusing, makes them question their competency. Unnecessary neglect by adults creates anxiety, self-criticism, and you want to find the balance in between, because this is a little bit of future growth, there's a little bit of autonomy, it sits right in between, right? So the warnings are the same. So now we're going to switch to adolescence. All right, so quick review. This is the biological stuff that happens in adolescence. We all start in our childhood. Then there's this middle phase called adolescence. And then there's this adulthood. So down on the bottom here, this is historically how society supported this developmental process. That for a while there, society absolutely supported the idea of childhood, that we let kids be kids. We took care of them, and then there was this middle phase where we understood and we helped prepare adolescents for their eventual adulthood. And at some point, society also provided the opportunities and the support so that they could successfully transition into this stage in their life where they could take care of themselves and take care of others, right? So historically, up until about 30 or 40 years ago, the biological changes that happened between birth and onset of puberty to about 24, 25 biologically was roughly supported by society sort of saying between 0 and a certain age, okay, you get to be a kid, all right, but you came of a certain age in your teenage years, okay, you got to start thinking about the future. You're going to get some more responsibility here. We're going to help you. Around 18, we're going to give you some adult opportunities, but you'll be surrounded by adults who are going to mentor you or teach you at college or show you the ropes or teach you these things. And by 24 to 25, a lot of people, through the experience between, let's say, 18 and 24, 25, got enough support, enough hands-on experience with their adolescent minds, learning from experience, that they gained a certain sense of competency. And up until about 30, 40 years ago, so you hit 25 and you basically were in the middle of probably your career. You were probably married. You probably had kids. And you probably had been doing all of that for a couple of years. And so when you were ready to be an adult at 25, you were actually ready to be an adult. All right, you see where this is going? All right, so let's revise the present and new model. Okay, so we said earlier that, okay, we still have childhood, but what do we say? We said 100 years ago, puberty didn't start till 16, right? And then now we have this number that keeps getting lower and lower. So childhood is shorter biologically, right? Which means that biologically adolescence is longer, right? So they got an earlier start where their brain says, look, you got to get ready to become an adult at 10 and a half. Weird, right? Okay. Still ends at 24, 25, and so your brain kind of goes into stable adult mode at 24, 25. All right, so that's biology. Okay, so childhood now, right? This is society now, culture. How do we support this? Okay, so kids come into the world, it's good, right? Okay, you get to be a baby. We're all right. We'll take care of you. And then somewhere around age 4, why can't you read? All right, okay, so you see where this is going? Okay, so maybe if we're not that bad, we let them kind of have their childhood and we let them play, and we let them, have very arranged play dates with only okay kids, and then you put on all the safety gear, read labels. Okay, so we do all this stuff as kids, right? We help them. All right, and then at some point, adolescence does start. And if adulthood is the phase in life where people can take care of themselves responsibly with autonomy and competency, and not only could they do that, they have the capacity to successfully take care of others as well. Not only their own needs, but they can take care of others as well. So adolescence starts a little bit earlier, right? We even invented a word for it, tweens, right? Where does adolescence end in the society in which we live right now? When, roughly, throw out some numbers, when do you think at this point are people ready to take care of themselves?
32. 31. 22.
Man, you guys are optimists. I think it looks like this.
They're not ready at all.
All right, so here's the challenge. And before we got started, you guys kind of mentioned that you were going to have a discussion, right? So here's the thing. We're going to continue on this talk, but this is actually one that's always useful, and every time I give this talk. And what I tell people is there will be no slides after this one where I give you the answers. This is what it is right now. And so the dilemma, the problem, and the challenge is that up until 30, 40 years ago, it aligned. That our society and our biology allowed for us to become self-sustaining, self-caring, other-caring adults by the time our brains became adults at 24, 25. What's happening these days is that window closes at 24, 25, and those same kids are living at home. They're in jobs. Even though they're in jobs, they're being told that you are too needy, that you need too much attention, you need too much praise. They're called millennials, right? We have all those labels. What's wrong with the millennials? So we got that going on. College education is not as valuable as it once been, but everyone's supposed to go to college. If you actually did attempt to get married and start having kids between 22 and 25, no one's going to let you, right? Because what do people tell you instead? They tell you that, through your 20s, you should really be figuring out who you are. You should. And people do that, okay? Even with support, loving families. They're told to do this, and they do. And they work on themselves. They try to live on their own. They start paying their own insurance bills. They start getting an apartment, live with their roommates. And then they hit 29, and everyone's like, why don't you have a boyfriend? Why don't you have a girlfriend? What's going on? Why don't you take life more seriously? What have you been doing? You're all over your 20s, right? And the crazy thing is, and the other thing is that, again, as complex as this thing is that I just said, it's hard to really place the blame or come up with a simple explanation as to how we got here, right? Do we blame the kids, the millennials, the parents, society, economics? All of it has to do with something, right? One of the changes that we definitely know is 30, 40 years ago, there was like an 80% chance that you're going to get married to somebody who lived within 5 miles of where you grew up. These days, you're probably going to marry a stranger you met online. Back 30, 40 years ago, the relationship that you built romantically was somebody that you kind of you were familiar with. Maybe, right? Same neighborhood, same town, maybe went to school together, maybe it's older brother or sister of somebody you knew. And then when you kind of start dating, it's just taking a relationship you already kind of had to the next level, right? We talk about adolescence, when you become super peer-oriented, right? Historically, that worked, meaning you started making your friends in junior high, and you kept them through high school, and you kept them for the rest of your life. And so when your brain said, you got to find a tribe, because these are the people that you will share life with, you did. But what happens now? You make friends in high school, you make friends in junior high, right? And then maybe most of you go to the same high school, some of you don't. Everyone goes away for college, right? Okay, but that's okay. Then you make these great friends in college for 4 to 5 years. And then what happens? Everyone goes back home. So you invested all these years in making friends in middle school and high school, but then you leave. And you make all these great friends in college, and then you leave. And then maybe you go back home, but everyone's kind of scattered. And then you go to work, and you got a job. But if your first job, you stay there longer than 1 to 3 years, something's wrong with you. You got to move. But those are where your friends are. But then you leave. And you can't date at work. It's frowned upon, right? So we have these biological drives that say make friends, form a tribe. Relationships are important. That drive that starts in middle school used to work. It used to support you and used to make you form genuinely these important relationships that would support you for the rest of your lives. And these days we keep moving. So that's one of the changes. Also the opportunities for people in their 20s to genuinely, even if you're hardworking, even if you're intentional, even if your parents supported you, the opportunities to make enough money to support yourself, start a family. The opportunities at 24, 25 are pretty small these days too, right? So those are the factors. This is the world we live in. So people in this room, our own teens, we're the ones that are going to solve it, but we need to, right? Because this is a problem. So, all right, that was depressing, sorry, okay. All right, we're going to bring it back up. We're going to bring it back up. But we'll bring it back up in 2 slides because this is kind of sad too. All right, so autonomy. All right, so you're a teenager now. You have a little bit more. You still have areas of future growth. Same idea, right? But same idea. You're still in the developmental phase. So you got this bleeding edge of zone of proximal development. And eventually, if you have the right support in this zone and the right opportunities and the right experiences, this becomes your future autonomy. You get closer and closer and closer to fulfilling all of our big human potential. All right, so areas of future growth. When you're a teenager, adolescent is able to do all this on their own. Same idea. As an adult, you have full responsibility. So and related to the slide that we just did right now, there's a little bit of that, right? Which is the responsibility of parents might extend a little bit longer than we previously expected because there's a lot of things that still exist in this area of future growth in which people who are adolescents are not able to do on their own. And expecting them to do these things on their own, similarly, just like kids, causes them to make compromises and improvise and guarantees frustration and unnecessary neglect by asking people at this stage in their life, whether they're 16 or they're 24 and a half and they have a college degree and they still can't find a job, does create anxiety and self-doubt, just the same. Autonomy, this is the area where the adolescent is able to do everything on their own with competency. The adult has minimal responsibility. Similarly, enjoy this, everybody. Allowing the adolescent to continue to do these things. There's a slight difference here. Now it supports one of these goals of adolescence, right? It's not just autonomy. It's the autonomy that supports their ability to see themselves as a competent individual. Unnecessary intervention by adults at this stage is very confusing. Makes them question their competency. All right, so a quick review. So,
is this the happy slide?
maybe 2 more slides. So back to adolescence. Okay, remember these are the things. All right, so I bring this up is now we got a different model. So when you got kids and you're the parent, you're the gardener. All right, but this stage we're trying to support them in their development towards autonomy, right, and self-sufficiency. So keep in mind these are their strengths. All right, so in the zone of proximal development, what do? The adolescent's ability at this stage is emerging. So instead of a gardener, though, in this stage in life, you have to think of yourself as a consultant. So has anyone ever been a consultant or used a consultant in business before, right? Okay, so how does that work, right? So you hire a consultant because on some level, you understand that there's something that you can't quite do within your own company and you'd like some help and you'd like some guidance. So you hire the consultant. The consultant has some expertise. They have some specific expertise that you don't have. So as a parent or as a teacher of kids who are in this age, if you thought about your consultant, I think this is the most ideal sense of the position that you can find yourself in. Appropriate support and scaffolding here, right, optimizes the growth in this area if you're a good, useful consultant. It facilitates self-reliance, right? Because consultants come in, they're not an employee, they support, they give you ideas, they help your company do better, right? And it also, good consultants work within the parameters of that company. They don't try to change it too much. They kind of understand, what the company's history is, what the company's goals are, what the company wants to be, right? Similarly, if you think about bad consultants, right? So bad consultants try to take over, bad consultants try to shove ideas, bad consultants force their ways, consultants criticize companies. And so the interesting thing is, in the very similar fashion, what allows actually most consultants to actually have the greatest influence within companies? It's actually positive relationships. It's trust. It's the belief that the consultant is competent or the consultant has something to offer. So that's why I think this is a better model if you kind of think about your role as a parent, as an educator, as a mentor in this stage. It's still built on your relationship. There still has to be trust. There still has to be respect. And once that's established, then when you come in that says, you know what, I do have a special expertise in this area. I think it's worth trying this way. That consultant might even get that company to do it, right? Same idea. Unnecessary intervention by adults is confusing, makes them question their competency. Unnecessary neglect by adults creates dependency, which goes against the goals of adolescence, right? Negative emotion, self-criticism, and want to find the balance in between. All right. 3 goals of adolescence: individuation, connectedness, significance. There's this other model of thinking about how human beings work. And the idea is that we're motivated to fulfill our needs. And if you look at whether it's Abraham Maslow or Marshall Rosenberg or people who do research in labs, what they find is almost all human needs fall into 3 categories: autonomy, competency, and relatedness. And what that means is that the 3 domains of all human needs fall into this one category of autonomy, which is that we want to be able to have choices and feel that the choices in our life matter, that we have the ability to direct our own lives. That's our needs for autonomy. Our needs for competency means that the stuff that we do, we want it to matter. we want to be competent, we want to be accomplished. And then the third category is relatedness, because we're born into this world dependent upon relationships for our well-being, and that never changes. So we always need to be connected to others. So one way to kind of think about, these three primary goals, and again, this is sort of the second theme of the night, is that these three goals of adolescence and these sort of more specific ways of finding their own identity through individuation, developing their social skills and forging their own chosen relationships, is this area of connectedness, mattering to others, and having a life of significance where they feel like what they do matters, is actually very much the three categories that I just mentioned as to sort of our core human needs, right? So another model of well-being based on positive psychology from Martin Seligman, and he basically says that, that people who experience positive emotion get to do things with their strengths that create positive results. People that have meaningful relationships, people have opportunity to use their strengths for things that are larger themselves, and people who have a sense of achievement and accomplishment in their life. People who got these five things in different measures consistently through their life tend to be happy. They tend to have happiness and well-being. And so if you kind of look at this as well, we talked about, emotionals, the development of emotions in the context of adolescence. We talked about the value of social engagement, right? And the ability to kind of use their abilities and strengths to do meaningful things. You kind of get a sense too that well-being is very much related to this. So, so here's more positive stuff, even though this slide. The positive factors in adolescence. Okay, so how do we do this? Relationships matter. If we're looking at research in terms of who are the teens that do the best, the teens that still have good relationships, whether that's good relationships still with their parents, with their siblings, with their peers, mentors, coaches. The more positive, useful relationships they have in their lives, the better they do. So relationships is still a key. Spirituality actually is one of the most studied things with the most positive results. And again, this is also one of these other things in the last 34 years that is diminishing. But people who study this, Lisa Miller is sort of the main person. She wrote a book called The Spiritual Child. She has a couple chapters very specifically in the teenage years. And I think this is the most impressive part, that in her research, she basically found that the biggest protective factor in your teenage years against depression, substance abuse, and risk-taking was whether or not you had an internal sense of a relationship with a higher being, more so than anything else.
Wow.
Go back to church, everybody. All right, bring your kids. Facilitation of the goals of individuation, connectedness, and significance. And I think speaking to this room and what you guys are here for and what you guys have invested yourself in, it's also something I strongly believe in. And hopefully that also really makes sense when we started sort of really talking about from childhood on. Why is it so important, right? There's this idea, this broken old idea, that if you get really good at reading, writing, and arithmetic, somehow the world is going to open up to you and you're going to have great opportunities. And I don't think we live in that world anymore. But we do live in a world where if you are emotionally competent, that you are socially competent, that you are a critical thinker, that you are self-motivated, that you have empathy, that those are the spaces in the world where people thrive these days. And so I think social emotional learning, if we can move that to the center, I think what happens is that all that other competency naturally follows, because, the desire to be accomplished, the desire to be self-motivated, the desire to do well is there, and you're going to have to learn how to read, write, and do math to do that stuff anyways. But if it's led by social and emotional competency, I think we're better off. So, learning to use the power of the adolescent mind can help us have a positive experience as it emerges during this period of, yes, intense change. When navigated well, these brain changes can lead to positive outcomes later on, holding on to the essential power of the teenage mind into later adolescence and beyond, into the adult years, can enable us to continue lifelong learning and recognize the important life-affirming sense of adventure, vitality, and courage that adolescence brings. Learning to use the power of the emerging adolescent mind well is as important for us as adolescents as it is for us adults. So this last picture, this is actually a process we're going through right now. So I think if we kind of really think about adolescence as this period of time of essentially remodeling, if you have a difficult remodeling experience, and we've all heard the horror stories, try to do too much on our own, we don't hire the right architect, we don't hire one at all, we hire a bad builder, we all feel like it could be a disaster. However, right, the other version of this is, though, right? With the right help and support, with the right people in your life, guiding you, right? The other version of this is maybe you get the house of your dreams. And that's what I got. Thank you.